My name is Heather Feldner. I am one of Mia's co-advisors, and
I'm Kat Steele from Mechanical Engineering. I think I know most of you. Thank you all so much for joining today.
yeah, thank you for coming. We're really excited to be here to celebrate all of Mia's hard work and to enjoy her defense today. Mia came to us from University of Notre Dame, and we have some connections with, yeah. And got her a Bachelor of Science in Mechanical Engineering there before coming here to UW, where she a couple of years ago got her master's in mechanical engineering and is now on the precipice of earning her PhD. And we just couldn't be proud of her and all of the work that she has put in to her time here at UW. And she's being recognized for this work. And so some of the things that we just wanted to point out and congratulate Mia on, it's been a big year. In particular, she was named to UW's Husky 100, which is a very prestigious recognition of the 100 very influential people across campus doing outstanding work in their fields and making an impact in our community. Last year, Mia was awarded the Dennis Lang awardee, or sorry, I was reading my slide, the Dennis Lang Award, which is an award within the Disability Studies program that recognizes excellence in disability studies work. And this year, we just found out last week, right? That she is the recipient of this year's UW Graduate Medal, which is a huge honor and very competitive. So yeah, extremely proud of all of that. Yes. Not only that, she did a lot of her work under an NSF graduate fellowship. So we're just really super proud of all of your accomplishments here. And you all are here today to learn about different pathways to self-initiated mobility and play. And in particular for children with disabilities who often don't get the opportunities that they should get from a standpoint of equity and access. We want to just take some time to acknowledge some of the achievements that Mia has accomplished over the last years. And one of these is just being a presenter extraordinaire. She was able to present across so many different venues, from engineering programs to rehab medicine programs to everything in between. And so this is just a variety of pictures from all of the different presentations and intersections with all of the different disciplines. One of our other trainees, Bethany, who's here in the audience today, wrote that she was struck by your energy and passion for mobility access. She already knew she loved collaborating with engineers, but you took it to a whole nother level. So that's really exciting. And then here are some other photos from across the lab.
Yeah, and I think here a big part was that they were, she's busy in the lab, busy in research, but she also knows how to have fun. I think Jen Mankoff from computer science said it well, her energy and caring are infectious wherever she goes. But then also she shows us all how research can be fun. And so I think many of you in the room have been on many adventures along the way with Mia. Mm-hmm. And then also today you'll be hearing about her PhD research, but she has had many other projects and side projects and pursuits during her time at UW, in particular around Husky Adapt and Create, where she's helped to lead these organizations and help build them into what they are today. So many things to celebrate and accomplish. And today, remember, we're here for the science and the engineering and asking tough questions afterwards, because then she'll have fewer questions and time from the committee, right? But we're really excited to see how this path continues to project from Notre Dame to UW. I always like to go back also to their graduate statements that they submit when they're applying for graduate school. And this is one from Mia. So she said, after completing my PhD, I plan to be a force for good in the world by starting my own research group to design affordable, personalized medical devices to improve the quality of life of the patient. And I think today you'll see how she's moving along that path, and we're also excited to see where she goes next. As I think many of you know, she has already accepted the Presidential Postdoctoral Fellowship at Ohio State University to further kind of pursue that goal along the way.
Awesome. And then I'm just going to end. I am actually using this book for another resource, but it's Mr. Rogers Talks with Parents. And it's from 1983. And I needed to find a quote in this book. And as I was reading, I was like, oh gosh, this is really sums up what Mia's work has been all about. So I just wanted to kind of turn it over to you with this thought. Children have to be problem solvers. From the moment they are born, the world presents itself as a huge set of puzzles that always seem to be changing. They have to they have to try things out with their senses, try them out again and again and again. They have to play with what they know to be true in order to find out more. And then they can use what they learn in new forms of play. And that it really sums up, I think, all of what Mia is going to talk about today.
So please join us in welcoming Mia Hoffman for her PhD.
Okay, well, y'all are gonna make me cry before I even get started. But as I said, I'm Mia, and today I'll be talking to you all about my lovely adventures into how we support self-initiated mobility for kids with developmental disabilities. So, how do we do that, you might be wondering? Well, let's take a roadmap to look at that. So first, we're going to start off at the Developmental Cascades toy store, and then we'll move to the On-Time Mobility info stand to learn a little bit more. Then we'll go stop by my garage to learn about rehabilitation engineering and how to measure devices. And then we'll jump into talking about some different research studies as we move through the Infinitely Accessible Neighborhood, PUMA Park, and the Mobility Aids Fair before we head to Future Highway. So let's head to the toy store to learn a little bit more. So what we know from developmental science is that when we see motor developmental gains, we see growth in other developmental areas. For example, when a child starts independently sitting, their hands are free to play with toys, which can support cause and effect learning, among other things. And we're in an upright trunk posture, where we see changes in airway alignment, which leads to the kids being able to make syllabic vocalizations like M and P. And when kids move to independent walking, we again see that growth of our hands are free to carry objects from place to place. We even see changes in caregivers' communication with their infants, such as using more action-related words like bring me that or show me this. And we're at a higher head posture, so we have an increased visual field. So we can see those toys across the room, and walkers are more likely to cross the room than crawlers to get a toy. So what does gross motor development look like? Well, those of you who might have a toddler at home might be familiar with this. Typically, developing infants typically start sitting at 6 months, crawling at 8 months, standing at 10 months, and walking at 12 months. But not all kids follow this typical timeline. Things like cultural practices, the artifacts a child interacts with, or disability can result in different timelines. For example, kids with Down syndrome, which is one of the most common chromosomal conditions that results in low muscle tone, intellectual disability, and balance and coordination issues, and results in 1 in 800 kids having this. Kids with Down syndrome typically start sitting independently at 10 months, crawling at 17 months, standing at 22 months, and walking a year or 2 years behind their peers. Or how about kids with cerebral palsy, which is a brain injury shortly before or after birth, and one of the most common neuromuscular conditions in kids. What we see is a super heterogeneous population here, with some kids being on an ambulatory timeline and start independently sitting at 10 to 12 months and taking their first steps between 18 months and 3 years, with some kids being on an alternative timeline, where they might use supported stepping devices or wheeled mobility to get around. Which brings me to the heart of our conversation today. Self-initiated mobility. Supporting kids going where they want to go. And Sam has frozen. Second. There we go. Supporting self-initiated mobility. Going where a kid wants to go, when they want to do it, in any form possible. So let's head to the On-Time Mobility info stand to learn a little bit more on a framework that guides our work. So the On-Time Mobility is a framework proposed by Sabat et al. 2022 that really advocates for 5 different principles: timing and urgency, access to mobility during critical developmental timelines, when neuroplasticity is the highest, multimodal mobility. There's no single correct form of mobility. We want kids to use any and all forms of self-initiated mobility, and we want to encourage that. Frequency. We want to provide mobility opportunities frequently throughout the day, not just in a clinic environment. And sociability. Mobility is most relevant when it supports things like social engagement, communication, and participation with others. So we can see those developmental cascades really trigger through. So how can we support on-time mobility? Well, mobility aids are one way we can do that. So mobility aids like orthotics, supported stepping devices, which might be a walker or a gait trainer, manual wheelchairs, and powered mobility devices. So current clinical guidelines advocate for the use of any and all mobility aids at the same time as typically developing peers start crawling and walking. But how are kids currently using these devices? Well, when we look at young kids with cerebral palsy under the age of 6, 2 recent reports, both here in the US and one in Norway, indicate that 75% of kids with CP use orthotics. But when we look at supported stepping devices, manual wheelchairs, and powered mobility, we see decreases, especially with that powered mobility, with only 10% of kids using it, even though the study reported that 33% of kids might have benefited. So what we see is that current clinical guidelines advocate for use of all mobility aids, but current use does not demonstrate this. So let's go back to our developmental timelines really quick and just look at when kids get access to devices. So a survey of American and Canadian providers found that the average age at which children are considered for powered mobility devices is 2 years and 3 months. And a survey of providers in the UK found that the average age at which kids are considered for a gait trainer is 2.5 years. Do you guys see something here? It's a gap. Kids don't get access to on-time mobility at the same time as their peers, and we need to support that. Which leads me to the question that drives what I do. How do young kids learn to use mobility aids, and how can we as engineers support that? And one way we can do that as researchers is really looking at that use, right? How can we measure their current device use so we can redesign devices and systems that support their future use? So with that in mind, let's head over to my garage to learn how we currently measure mobility aid use. Well, welcome to my garage. I've got a lot of different sensors here for you. So clinically, interventions might be tracked using standardized clinical assessments like the Bayley Scales of Infant Development or Gross Motor Function Measure, written activity logs, and caregiver-completed surveys. In research settings, my colleagues might use interviews with caregivers or timely annotations of events of interest on videos, like watching and clicking every single 6 seconds when a kid is stepping. So I know that can take a lot of time. What's the way we can maybe do it quicker and a little more accurately? Well, we could use our engineering skill set to do that. We could use things like embedded systems and instrumentation, inertial measuring units, GPS positions, or we could use our traditional biomechanics tools like electromyography or EMG, which measures muscle activity, or motion capture. So we're going to use all these different tools today to really look at how young kids are using different mobility aids. So let's pick up some mobility aids. So there's a lot of devices already on the market and more coming through every day to support mobility for kids 5 and under. But we only have about 40 minutes left, so we're only going to talk about 2 of them today: bodyweight support systems and powered mobility devices. So we're going to use 3 different mobility aids. The first is the PUMA, which is an open area partial bodyweight support system that you can buy from Enlighten LLC for about $4,000. It can be used by any kids 60 pounds or under, and basically how this works is it's kind of like a gantry system for you mechanical engineers in the room, where we have a passive off-weight system that allows a child to move in a 9-foot by 9-foot area with some support while they wear a harness. So that's our first device. Our second is the modified ride-on car. So this is if you went to Walmart, got a toy ride-on car off the shelf, brought it home, used your soldering skills to modify the controls to be activated by a large switch that's typically mounted on the steering wheel, and then we add structural supports using PVC, kickboard, or anything else you can find at Home Depot. And these are typically adapted by volunteers in the community and provided to kids 5 and under for free or low cost. And then finally, we have the Permobile Explorer Mini, which you can actually see right up here. which is an FDA-cleared commercially available device approved for kids 12 to 36 months. You can buy it for the low cost of $3,000. And in comparison to our ride-on car, this one's controlled via a joystick, which gives you a little bit more directional control. And also, we can adjust the seating in it. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and talk about the studies today. I'm going to give you guys just a little highlight. So we're going to talk about 4 different studies. The first is looking at how families are using ride-on cars in their home environment. The second, we're going to do a comparison of ride-on cars and Explore Minis to compare their device use at home. Third, we're going to look at changes in fitness and function when kids are using the PUMA. And then finally, we're going to do a deep dive into the last study of my dissertation, where we did a comparison of the Explore Mini and the PUMA. And there we'll look at changes in fitness and user engagement. So now that we've got the map of where we're going, let's go ahead and head to the infinitely accessible neighborhood to learn a little bit more about ride-on cars and Explore Minis and how we're using them at home. My friend here is going to demonstrate the ride-on car for you. So ride-on cars have been in existence for a couple of decades now, but we can really see the growth in them is in 2012 when Hoffman and Galloway published a technical report where they said, here's how you can build a ride-on car and use it. And since then, we've seen an explosion of research with 66 papers to date looking at how kids are using ride-on cars. So what does this data tell us? Well, the devices are fun to use for kids. This is typically measured using the fun index, which is a 1 to 10 scale. It promotes socialization, especially in things like playgroups or with siblings. Reduces caregiver stress. We see mobility gains and developmental gains when kids use it. And something I really like to see, increase environmental interaction, with some papers reporting that kids are looking around more when they're using it or reaching out to touch something on the wall. But a lot of this research is from our more clinically focused measures, right? We see a limited use of quantitative measures with only 4 out of 66 papers using things like integrated data loggers, wearable sensors, or gait metrics to measure device use. So this is where we as engineers can use our mindset to better measure how kids are using ride-on cars. From this research, we also know that there's a lot of barriers to device access and use. Things like it being hard to turn the steering wheel while also pressing the switch. They can be a little bulky to carry up and down stairs, right? Caregivers have lack of time to use it. And something we're going to focus on today is inaccessible surfaces and inadequate space to use it and how that impacts device use. So in this first study, we're going to look at how kids are using ride-on cars at home. We're going to answer 2 questions. How does driving location affect device use? And here we hypothesize that when kids are using it outside of their home, we're going to see increased ride-on car usage, again, going back to that inadequate space barrier. And then secondarily, as a more exploratory aim, we looked at how the built environment impacts device use, and we hypothesized that when there's a more accessible environment, kids would move more using the modified ride-on car. So how do we measure this? So we gave families integrated data loggers put into a ride-on car, and those loggers use things like microcontrollers and embedded electronics to measure switch activations, so when you press the switch, GPS, where we are, and wheel rotation, so it can measure things like distance traveled. And then we gave these devices to 14 kids with developmental disabilities in the Western Washington area to use for a year as they saw fit. So how did use change outside versus inside? Well, so we differentiated in-home and out-of-home usage by the presence of GPS data and geofencing. GPS signal is typically not available in buildings due to the need of line-of-sight signals. So using that logic, we were able to do a comparison of outside versus inside use. And what we see when we look at session duration, we see significant increases in how long a child is using their ride-on car when they're outside compared to inside. When we look at active driving, how much of the time they're actively pressing the switch and going, we see that kids are actively moving for longer when they're using the ride-on car outside versus inside. And then when we look at distance driven, how far they're going, we see that kids are going further distances outside when they're using the device outside versus inside. And now you're probably going like, yeah, there's more space to move. and this aligns with our previous literature that said inadequate space was a barrier. But it's still awesome to see that when kids are using the ride-on car outside, we're seeing increased use. So now let's look at that secondary exploratory aim. So to look at the impact of accessible infrastructure on device use, we collaborated with folks in ECE and CSE who are developing Project Sidewalk, which is an open source mapping initiative that uses Google Maps to identify how accessible the sidewalks are by identifying things like surface issues or barriers obstructing the path. And then from this data, they created a measure called the access score, which is a 0 to 1 score of how accessible the environment is. So and then we can use that data to see how accessible the sidewalks are near one of our participants' homes, shown here with the star. And what we see is it's fairly inaccessible around their home, with the street in front of them being the most accessible. And now let's compare that to their driving map. And what we see is they're primarily driving on the street in front of their home or an alley behind it. And they only have 5 sessions. How does that compare with somebody who lives in a more accessible area? So P10 lived in a more accessible area, and what we see is that they found a route near their home that was really accessible and drove on that 52 times. And now I want to draw your eye to this yellow path over here, where we see them detour about 2/3 of the way through the study onto an inaccessible path. And then they never visited it again. And they actually mentioned in interviews that they had found an inaccessible path and, again, avoided it for the future. So what we saw with our initial look at Project Sidewalk data is accessibility matters. So this was the first study to provide quantitative evidence showing the impacts of environmental accessibility on kids' mobility. Right? We saw that environmental accessibility impacts mobility intervention success, which is really important when we're thinking about how we're giving and providing and supporting kids as they use devices. And also from an engineering contribution standpoint, we combined embedded electronics with GPS sensing and open source data paths to measure community-based device use and accessibility. So we're going to use the GPS methodology we developed here as we transition to the next study, which also includes the Explore Mini. So my friend here is going to demonstrate the Explore Mini for you. So as you can see, she's been pushing on and off the joystick and kind of doing an exploratory way of moving. So as I said, the Explore Mini was FDA cleared in April of 2020, shortly before I started my PhD. And shortly thereafter, Plummer et al. Released a feasibility study where they'd had 33 kids with disabilities come in and they completed a clinical assessment to see how they used the device after a single interaction. And what we saw was 94% of kids were able to use the Explore Mini on their first try. And since then, there's been 2 other studies really led by our team, a multi-site clinical trial looking at how 24 kids with cerebral palsy use the Explore Mini compared to a modified ride-on car in their home environment. And then an in-lab study that our team did here at the University of Washington in the AMP lab, which is right by Agua Verde, looking at how 9 kids with disabilities learned to use the Explore Mini over 12 sessions. And what we found from this short research life is that we saw developmental gains when kids were using the Explore Mini, social emotional growth, language gains, cognition growth, right? We saw improvements in quality of life, like kids having positive reactions when they were using the Explore Mini, and potential sleep improvements. And from our engineering metrics from the UW in-lab study, we saw that kids generally make short joystick activations, with most of them being less than 3 seconds. We saw learning across time in our across the 12 sessions, and kids were moving further distances as their skills progressed. So, what other studies have looked at comparing powered mobility devices? Well, one study had children come in for a single session where they could use up to 4 different devices, which are shown here in this picture, and then they used clinically focused measures to show that controllability changes between devices and access methods like using a switch or a joystick might influence powered mobility device use for these kids. And then a second study that looked at how 2 different groups of children, 10 who tried the weight shift device and 10 who used a joystick device, over 5 sessions used it. And what they showed is that it was easier for kids to use the weight shift to control. But I want to just point out here that they use non-disabled kids in this study. And both of these studies use clinically focused measures, but how can we use our engineering insights to really do a better job comparing their use? And a big limitation of these studies is that they compared device use in the clinic in structured settings and not at home, which is where kids typically use a device, especially when we're thinking about early intervention. So in this next study, we're going to compare how device use between two powered mobility devices, the Explore Mini and the modified ride-on car. And we hypothesized that Explore Mini use would be higher than the modified ride-on car due to it being a commercially available device that might be a little easier to control. And then as a secondary exploratory aim, we compared 3 tracking methods. So we used 3 tracking methods: integrated loggers, which we only had on the ride-on cars because we didn't mess with the electronics of the Explore Mini; GPS trackers, which could just mount onto the back, and caregivers would press a button to get started; and then written activity logs, where after each time a child used the device, they would write it down. But today, to save time, we're only going to talk about the outcomes from the GPS measure, where we're going to look at number of play sessions, unique days used, play session duration, and total distance traveled. So kids were provided these devices in a crossover study design where children used both devices for 8 weeks. So either having the Explore Mini first or the modified ride-on car first. And in this sub-analysis, we had 12 children with cerebral palsy at 3 different sites use the devices. So let's look at how the devices compare. So on the x-axis, we have the two different devices. On the right side, you have the Explore Mini, and on the left side, you have the modified ride-on car, which will be in pink. So when we look at the comparisons here, we don't see any significant differences between usage, even though it's a little higher with the Explore Mini, with a median of 14 sessions with the Explore Mini and a median of 8 sessions with the ride-on car. Again, when we look at the number of days used, we don't see any significant differences using Wilcox and rank sum tests, but we do see kind of a visual increase across trends, with a median of 10 days with Explore Mini and 7 days with the ride-on car. And then when we look at session duration, it's really similar between devices, with kids using them for a median of 8 to 9 minutes. And then when we look at total distance traveled, again, we see they're pretty much in a similar time scale, but over those 8 weeks, we see a median of 10 kilometers with the Explore Mini and 3.5 kilometers moved with the modified ride-on car. So we didn't see any significant changes from our GPS tracker, but when we looked at our caregiver reported activity log data, we did see significant increases in the Explore Mini use. So in this study, we demonstrated distinct use patterns between the 2 different powered mobility devices, and may see some increased use with the Explore Mini. And then we did, as our secondary aim, we looked at the 3 different tracking methods. And what we really saw is that quantitative and qualitative measures gathered 2 different measures. And really with the caregivers measuring device use when the child was in the device and it wasn't moving, when quantitative measures only measured when the device was moving. And from an engineering standpoint, we systematically compared 3 tracking methods to identify strengths and limitations of the devices, which can then help us as we redesign tracking for future in-home studies. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and move to PUMA Park, where we're going to look at changes in fitness and function. So my little friend here is going to show you how he moves around in the PUMA. So, and as you can see here, there's a passive weight offset that's just basically sandbags that you clip on that's providing kind of that body weight support. So, and we typically set it to about 20 to 30% of their body weight. So, open area partial body weight support systems are collapsible and portable, which you can't really see in some of the pictures I've shown, so I just want to let you know about that. So we can set them up in different environments, like different rooms in the IHED, which you're at right now. But what we see from the research is that they support engagement, with them being enjoyable for both kids to use and parents to use. And yes, families have set them up in their living room and left them there for months in research. And we've seen them increase kids' socialization with siblings and friends. And we also see developmental gains in motor when kids are using the PUMA, with kids being able to achieve new motor milestones when they're using it. For example, one study showed that a child with Down syndrome achieved milestones such as pulling to stand or independently walking earlier after using the PUMA at home. They used those earlier than expected for kids with Down syndrome. Kids are moving further distances with the PUMA, with one study reporting that 2 kids moved between 10 and 50 meters when they used the PUMA. And we also see gross motor gains. But most of this evidence is from case studies where there might be 1 or 2 kids and short-term trials where maybe they're only using the device a few times, which leaves a gap in the current literature. So you're probably wondering why we're talking about fitness and function. You all go to the gym every day. Well, research shows that kids with Down syndrome have reduced physical activity levels compared to typically developing peers. And recent work by Kretsch et al. Showed that infants with cerebral palsy are 3.5 times more likely to be supine on their back and 0.14 times as likely to be standing compared to their typically developing peers. So, and what we know though is that increased time in standing postures supports bone density, improves anti-gravity strength, so working on things like balance and being upright, and supports bowel function, among other things. So we really want to support both physical activity and standing for kids. So how can the PUMA help support that? So in this next study, we're going to look at how PUMA use affects physical activity levels. And we hypothesize that kids are going to have higher physical activity levels when they're using the PUMA. And then we're going to look at how much time kids are spending in upright postures using the PUMA. And again, we hypothesize that kids' time in upright postures is going to increase with the PUMA due to it being a little bit easier to get up due to that weight offset. So to measure this, we use an ankle-worn accelerometer, which we can quantify physical activity from by using movement counts, which is basically a way to quantify the magnitude of the body motion over time by looking at how high that accelerometer is. So for example, high physical activity would be when the accelerometer is moving a lot, and low would be when it's moving a little. And then we can also use that accelerometer as an inclinometer to measure upright postures. So this was a randomized crossover clinical trial where kids either had the partial body weight support first and did 9 sessions in that, and then 9 sessions without partial body weight support, or vice versa. And we had 15 kids participate in the study across 3 different sites. So how does partial body weight support impact physical activity? Well, at baseline, so this is the first session in the condition, kids had high physical activity levels overall. Without partial body weight support, there was a median of 68% of the sessions spent in high physical activity, and with partial body weight support, 63%. Now, let's look at the differences from that first session to the 9th session, so the end of the block. And what we see is no group level increases when kids are using the PUMA or not using the PUMA. So what we see is that kids are maintaining high physical activity levels with and without partial body weight support, which might be due to engagement with our interventionist. So how does time in upright postures change? So we looked at changes in physical activity, but when kids start standing statically, which maybe they're doing in the PUMA, their physical activity might decrease or stay the same because they're not going to be moving, so that accelerometer is frozen. So if we look at the baseline, so first session, what we see is kids are spending a similar amount of time in upright postures. Without partial body weight support, 13%. With partial body weight support, a median of 10%. But when we look at the change from the first session to the last, we see a positive increase in time upright with partial body weight support, with the median increase of 2.4% and median decrease without partial body weight support of -1%. So what we saw in this study is that partial body weight support increases upright time while maintaining physical activity levels, which addresses a common clinical risk concern about reducing physical activity levels when we're using different devices. This was the first multi-site clinical trial evaluating open area partial body weight support use. And from an engineering standpoint, we estimated posture from a single accelerometer. For future accuracy, though, I'd like to use two sensors, one on the shank and one on the thigh, for increased accuracy of estimation. So now with that in mind, let's head to Mobility Aids Fair. And it's called the fair because you're only using the devices once in this last study, like a ride at the fair. So we've covered a lot of ground today. Let's go ahead and recap what we've done so far. So first, we tracked home use with a modified ride-on car. Then we compared two different powered mobility devices, the ride-on car to the Explorer Mini. And then finally, we looked at changes in fitness and function using the PUMA. So you're probably seeing where I'm going at this point, huh? How does powered mobility and partial body weight support compare? A lot of researchers looked at this comparison between powered mobility devices, maybe when they're sitting or standing, but no one's really done this a large-scale comparison of kids using a powered mobility device versus more of an ambulatory device like a gait trainer or partial body weight support system. So that's what we did in this last study. But first I want to show you guys some results from our in-lab study led by Dr. Zeno, where she did a comparison of kids using the Explorer Mini in a seated posture and a supported stand posture, where we would move the seat of the Explorer Mini up 2 dots. So just about 6 inches higher. So kids were in more of a supported stand posture. And when we put some wearable sensors on their legs to measure muscle activity, we saw they were pretty comparable across conditions, with a slight increase in that supported stand posture when kids were moving. But something really fun about the Explorer Mini, which I've already revealed a little bit by taking the seat off entirely of our Explorer Mini up here, you can take the seat off. So then you can use it as kind of a more of a dynamic stander, which is really kind of a novel device interaction. But only 1 out of 9 participants in Dr. Zeno's study were able to use the Explorer Mini in this condition because they were already able to independently stand and stabilize themselves enough for long enough to play in the Explorer Mini for about 20 minutes. And when we look at their muscle activity when they're using this device, we see elevated quadriceps muscle activity in that no seat condition shown here in the maroon. So I'm going to show you guys a video of this. So you guys noticed we had some joystick activations, we moved, but we also saw that moment where there was a little bit of a squat. Right, I'm going to play it again just so you can really see it. Right, we see a little bit of a squat here, where we kind of give him a reminder of, hey, it's time to stand. And it's either, did he forget that we took the seat out, or is he getting a little fatigued? So we wanted to support him in his future use by creating the dynamic seat. So to address these challenges, we created the dynamic seat that uses leather straps, mounting spots already available on the Explorer Mini, and a soft gait trainer seat you can buy for about $200 online. So we wanted to test this in our study. So bringing all of these lessons learned together throughout this entire PhD journey we've talked about so far, let's jump into the final study, where we will combine our engineering, biomechanics, and disability studies skill sets to look at changes in user engagement and fitness when we're using the PUMA and the Explorer Mini. So we asked 3 questions in the study. How does the type of mobility affect movement? And we hypothesized that when kids were using the Explorer Mini, we see increased areas of the room explored. Again, the Explorer Mini moves pretty fast when you press the joystick. How does the type of mobility affect muscle activity? Building on those results from Zeno et al. 2024. And we hypothesized that when kids were using either mobility aid, we'd see increases in muscle activity because they'd be able to get into new postures that they might not be able to when they're not using any mobility aids. And then, building on what we learned from Sloan et Hoffman 2025, we saw that combining quantitative and qualitative measures to measure different things, we really wanted to ask the parents what they thought of this devices. So we asked, how do caregivers perceive these different types of mobility aids? Really getting into kind of more of that user interaction metrics. So we're going to look at 4 different modes of mobility. Unassisted, when kids are moving as they currently move now, with partial body weight support, using the Explore Mini with a traditional rigid seat, which looks just like this, and the Explore Mini with a dynamic seat, which you can see modeled over here. So kids came in for 5 lab-based sessions where we looked at their movement, muscle activity, and body posture across these 4 conditions. So in that first visit, participants were shown the devices. A pediatric physical therapist who's sitting in the room right now completed a clinical assessment of gross motor function to quantify their current mobility, because the kids on the study had a lot of different mobility at the start, and we invited them to complete a short semi-structured interview. And then kids came in for 4 more sessions that were all about play. So families would come in the door. We would put wearable sensors on their legs and back to measure their muscle activity and body posture. And then we put neon-colored tape on their shirt or on the device to track where they're going using 4 synchronized cameras in the room. And then most importantly, we would engage in 30 minutes of play using either the PUMA, the Explore Mini, or no mobility aids. And this was really child-led exploratory play. We played with the toys they wanted to play with, went where they wanted to go. And then at the end of the study, we again asked caregivers to complete a quick semi-structured interview and complete a few surveys. So, who could participate in our study? Kids who were independently sitting or prop sitting for at least 10 seconds, but weren't yet taking independent steps, had a neuromuscular condition like cerebral palsy or Down syndrome, and most importantly, they were able to fit in our Explore Mini, which means they were less than 39 inches tall or 35 pounds or less. So we had 16 participants complete all study procedures. 5 children had Down syndrome. 5 had different genetic conditions. 4 kids had a diagnosis of cerebral palsy or were at risk of cerebral palsy due to things like prematurity. 1 child had spinal muscular atrophy, and 1 child had a mitochondrial disorder. All these kids had in common things like low muscle tone or high muscle tone. And kids' mobility really varied throughout the study, with some kids just starting to sit, some crawling quickly around the room, and some already taking supported steps using a walker. So, what did we measure? Well, to look at movement patterns, we looked at area explored. So that's the amount of the room they were able to get around. We looked at integrated muscle activity and time and upright postures using our wearable sensors. And then we had caregivers complete 2 surveys. The QBEC user evaluation of satisfaction with technology 2.1 children's version, which is a mouthful, so we're going to call it the Quest, which is a 1 to 7 Likert scale with 8 items, asking things like, what do you think about the weight or the size of the device? Really getting some of those more design metrics. And then a second survey, which we're going to call the implementation measures, which looked at the acceptability, appropriateness, and feasibility of the device as an intervention. Really getting some more of that clinical mindset. And then finally, we asked families to participate in semi-structured interviews, comparing the different devices. So let's go ahead and look at those results. I know you're all awaiting that. So to look at where we're going, we use motion tracking. So currently available motion tracking systems have a hard time with kids. Have you ever tried to put an optical motion tracker on a toddler? If they have good enough fine motor skills, they like to pluck it off. Or something like our PUMA, which is a giant aluminum frame, can be really reflective, making that difficult. And current markerless systems use machine learning and are trained on adults, so have a hard time identifying when we have small kids in the frame, especially when there's a lot of adults present. So we created our own motion tracking system to go back to the 1980s and use some old biomechanics techniques modernized to track neon-colored markers on the device or on the child. So to do that, we would use object detection, where we would use hue saturation value or the specific parameters of the color to identify where the pink or green tape was in the room across time. And then before each session, we would get a calibration, which would give us the intrinsic and extrinsic parameters of where the cameras were in the room. And then we could bring that information together to get a lovely map of where kids are going over those 30 minutes of play. So then we could take this movement map and break it down into a grid to determine area explored. So we'd see how many of these different squares they'd visit, And then we would sum those together and normalize it by the capture value to get a normalized measure of area explored. And then when we look at this for the 4 different conditions, what we see is significant increases when kids are using the Explore Mini, most notably in that dynamic seat condition. So, yay, our first hypothesis was correct. Now, let's go ahead and look at the data from our wearable sensors. So we had wearable sensors on a child's neck, back, and legs that measured their muscle activity. This is the first study to look at how kids are using the PUMA with muscle and looking at their muscle activity, and the first with the Explore Mini measuring muscle activity in their back and neck. So how do we measure muscle activity? Well, we place wearable sensors on kids' legs while somebody else distracts them. We use CENIUM guidelines to know exactly where to place them, wrap them tight with Coban, and hopefully put some joggers on so that they forget about them. And those sensors, we can measure the differential between 2 electrodes to look at changes in electrical activity, which is muscle activity. And then we can do some post-processing and filtering to get the integrated muscle activity over time. And we're going to look at it in 15-second epochs. And then to get one summary metric for each session, we're going to look at just the median value. And when we look at the cervical paraspinal muscles located on the back of your neck, we can see there's no significant changes across conditions. So how about on the erector spinae on your lower back? And again, we don't see any significant differences across conditions. So let's go ahead and jump down to the legs. So when we look at the quadriceps muscle, which runs on the front of your thigh, we see significant differences primarily between the 3 conditions in the Explore Mini rigid, with muscle activity being lower when kids are in that Explore Mini with the rigid seat. And again, I just want to highlight here, these results look eerily similar to Zeno et al. 2024, where we see in that study we saw increases in the quadricep muscle activity when kids were using the Explore Mini as a dynamic stander. And here, when we add the gait turner seat, it doesn't impact. We see a similar result. And when we look at the biceps femoris on the back of the leg, again, we see significant differences, this time really between the Explore Mini conditions and the non-Explore Mini conditions, with the muscle activity being slightly higher and the partial body weight support in unassisted conditions. Now, let's move down to the shank. So first looking at the medial gastrocnemius, which is located on the back of the shank, we don't see any significant changes across conditions. And looking at the tibialis anterior, which runs alongside the front-ish of your shank, what we see is, again, no significant differences. And this kind of makes a little sense that we're only seeing differences in those muscles at the thigh. A lot of these kids might not have been spending time in standing or kneeling postures. So this kind of makes sense. With that in mind, let's look at our posture results. So using wearable sensors on the thigh and shank, we're able to approximate time upright. So using these sensors, we could then look at how they aligned with an upright position that we identified using known markers in the data, and we could approximate whether that sensor was upright or not upright. And then when we classified that both a sensor on the shank and a sensor on the thigh is upright, we can get a measure of posture over time. So, and when we bring that all together, what we see is that kids are generally standing a little bit more when they're using the Explore Mini with a dynamic seat. 7 kids spend the greatest time upright in standing postures when they're using the powered mobility in the dynamic seat. 5 kids spend the greatest time upright in a standing posture when they're using the partial body weight support here in purple. And 3 kids spend the greatest time upright in a standing posture during this unassisted condition. And our last participant, P22, who had the highest GMFM scores, so highest motor function, spend the greatest proportion of time upright in the power mobility dynamic condition of all kids across all sessions, when he spent 31% of the session standing. So now that we've looked at the quantitative measures, let's go ahead and switch over to looking at what our caregivers thought. First, we're going to look at the survey results, which are measured using things like Likert scales. So when we look at the Quest results, first, which is a measure of device satisfaction, and I just want to orient you that we want to head towards the smiley face. What we see is that we see significant differences between the Explore Mini and the PUMA with device satisfaction being higher for the Explore Mini. And these really big changes were driven by device size and portability, with the PUMA being viewed as maybe not as portable. And then let's look at how caregivers felt about this as an implementation. And again, we want to go towards the smiley face. So what we see is that caregivers generally thought both devices were acceptable for their child to use. They were appropriate as an intervention. But when we talk about feasibility, that's where we really see the big differences, with caregivers finding the Explore Mini more feasible to use than the PUMA. So how does this reflect in our interviews, you might be wondering? Well, let's go ahead and look at our semi-structured interviews data that we completed with families before and after the study. And we had a few additional families participate in these interviews who didn't complete all study procedures. But we asked questions like, what are the drawbacks of the device? Or what are the benefits of them? What do you think your child preferred? So when we look at interviews, we don't just read the quotes or listen to a conversation. We actually systematically analyze these, doing things like thematic analysis. So something like all the devices at home becomes multimodal mobility, and it's too advanced for her becomes device mismatch. And then we can bring these codes together into themes like right sizing and the realities of daily use. So what we have we had 4 themes overall from our analysis. The first being pressure to measure up to developmental expectations, which really got to the tension that caregivers feel as they want to support their child's developmental trajectory. They don't want to hold her back. They want to support their independence. But really dealing with some of those questions of like, do mobility aids help or hinder this? At the same time, we heard our second theme, growth and learning through mobility aids, celebrating inchstones and small wins. Right, with the Explore Mini, we heard things like, my child's able to go from one place to another, and that's really exciting. Or with the PUMA, she was standing on her own, which is something she's not able to do at home. She's always holding on to something. In our third theme, right sizing and the realities of daily use, this is where families thought about, what if I brought this device out of the clinic, right? They said, one of the families who actually already had an Explore Mini at home said, my child thinks it's really cool, but they get apprehensive about being in it and being in new things and asked to get taken out, right? So it's about finding the device that works well for a child, and also finding how a home or environment supports that, right? Homes can sometimes be a nightmare for mobility aids when participants live in townhomes where they have to carry a gait trainer up and down stairs. And in our fourth theme, navigating new systems of care and access, a lot of the families in the study were new to disability, with some kids maybe have just gotten a diagnosis, or a lot of kids not having one yet. So families might be struggling to find the help their child needs, especially when systemic problems like insurance make it challenging. But we also saw enablers of mobility aid access, where physical therapists and occupational therapists work with their child to support whatever mobility decision she wants. Whether she's using a mini manual wheelchair like her Bumba, using her walker, they're following the child's lead and going where she wants to go. So what we saw in this work is it's not one or the other. It's about having both devices. When we looked at area explored, we saw increases when kids were using the Explore Mini. When we looked at muscle activity, we saw increases in the unassisted and partial body weight support conditions compared to the Explore Mini. When we look at posture, we saw that the Explore Mini with our dynamic gait trainer seat led to the most upright time for 7 out of 14 kids. And when we asked families what they thought about the devices, they felt that the Explore Mini was more feasible than the PUMA to use. And really, one of our families summarized it the best. It's really important for my child to have autonomy of doing what they want, right? It's important to give them mobility aids as they're growing. They're not preventing them from learning crawling or walking. It's a chance for them to roam around by themselves independently for a little bit of the day, while also working on physical therapy exercises. It's a little bit of both. So in this work, we provided evidence for access to multiple mobility aids that support different therapy goals. This was the first study to quantify kids' movement patterns and biomechanics across multiple different mobility aids. And then from an engineering standpoint, we really focus on supporting getting things into the clinic, right? We developed an easy-to-deploy motion capture system that only used 4 cameras and some neon tape. And we designed a dynamic seat for the Explorer Mini that can be quickly built and put on. So with that entail, let's go ahead and head towards Future Highway as we pass through the light at the end of the tunnel. So as we end any dissertation, we want to talk about the impact of this work. In our first study, we saw that the use of mobility aids is contingent upon accessible infrastructure and environment. And from an engineering standpoint, we use GPS tracking to look at how kids are currently using powered mobility devices. In our second study, we compared the Explorer Mini and the modified ride-on car and saw that kids' use of the Explorer Mini was slightly higher. And from an engineering standpoint, we did a systematic comparison of device tracking methods to look at how we're using mobility aids in community settings, which can then help us to inform the design of new trackers. In our third study, we showed that open area partial body weight sports like the PUMA provide increased opportunity for standing practice, which might be something easy to set up in a home or clinic for a couple months. And we use an estimated toddler posture from a single Shank-born IMU. And I promise you, if you haven't tried to put an IMU on a toddler, 1 is a lot easier than 4 or 6. And finally, in this last study, we looked at different device types and configurations, and we found that they could support different therapeutic goals. And we developed a clinically translatable motion capture system. So from this dissertation, we have 5 different papers, 2 of which are already published, 1 of which is under review and should be published in the next month or 2, and 2 that are in preparation to submit by the end of summer. So with that, let's head towards Future Highway. So we talked about how we could support adoption and continued use of mobility aids, but we only looked at 2. There's a lot more ways we can support it. Or we could work with families to co-design the next generation of mobility aids, ones that are lightweight, maybe support multiple different ways of using it, and grow with the child. Or we could look at alternative ways that kids are accessing devices. Maybe it's not feasible for every kid to have a device in home they're using 4 or 5 times a week. Maybe we need a community space where they're using it 1 or 2 times. And what's the difference in having those access patterns? And what we saw in our work is we only looked at when kids are using 1 device at home. But a lot of our kids have multiple devices at home. They have a gait trainer, a stander, a walk, and a wheelchair. How does device use change between that? Is there a preferred? How do we identify that? So we should look at measuring multimodal device use in home environments. Now, I'm super excited to jump into looking at some of this in my next steps as I head to Ohio State to start work with Dr. Jill Heathcock, looking at how we can support play and mobility for children with unilateral cerebral palsy. And I just like to highlight some of the other work I haven't had time to talk about today. The team SwitchKit helped us build the SwitchKit, which is an open source play tool for kids with disabilities. And one of my colleagues and I have been looking at how engineering education supports or doesn't support teaching kids about disability. And I just like to thank all my wonderful collaborators who have made all this research possible. And as you know, dissertations take a village. I'd really like to thank my advisors, Kat Steele and Heather Feldner, for supporting me through all this. Members of the Impact Collaboratory and Neuromechanics and Mobility Lab, past and present. I know some of you are on Zoom right now. A special shout out to my undergraduates and physical therapy students who have supported so much of this research, and you've seen them featured on these slides. Friends in the department that are here right now, who've joined me on so many adventures inside and outside of campus, especially Carlos, you just defended yesterday. Congratulations, doctor. To my friends here on Zoom and the Owley crew for giving me a space away from engineering and research to get out to the woods, run and hike. And my family who's answered every single phone call, supported me every day, and kept me running, who I wouldn't be here without. And Jeff, thank you for being beside me every single day. Thank you, guys. Glad they take it.